Hello once again, I'm Dr. Chuck Kowalewski, a S3 controller and mentor here at the VATSIM Jacksonville RTAC. I'm also an IFR pilot. We are going to be talking on the next class, which is number 5, how to issue a clearance. Like the previous 4 and the next class, you'll be tested on the knowledge of these slides and this lecture prior to your first practical in the sweatbox with your mentor or instructor. So if you have any questions at all, please reach out to your mentor or instructor to get those questions clarified before your first practical instruction. So as usual, we go over the agenda. We're going to talk about an example of a clearance, and then we're going to get into the tools and resources, the meat of the matter of how to issue a clearance, and we'll also talk about how you communicate entering into that clearance delivery position and getting out of it. And then there will have a few examples to do some clearance practice before we're done. This class is a little longer than the others because it has a lot of detail in it, but I hope you'll enjoy it. So a clearance issue example would be following the craft mnemonic, which is clearance, route, altitude, frequency, and transponder. And here it shows what's part of the flight plan. So the arrival airport, the route that was in the flight plan box that you've seen previously, the initial altitude in thousands is identified either by the departure procedure or an SOP. And then the final altitude is given in the flight plan, and it's always in 10 minutes. The frequency they'll be talking to after they leave the domain of the tower, and the transponder that they're supposed to be set to. So some tools that are useful. A lot of folks like FlightAware because you can look up real world routes between the airports, and that will also show you the routes in real world they're using. AirNav is probably the best website for quickly looking up various information about any particular airport and any charts that you would need for SIDS or stars, because you can pull it, once you pull up the airport, it shows you the SIDS and stars for that airport. I personally like SkyVector because it sort of brings it all together in that the one site gives me access to all of the SIDS and stars as well as the airport diagrams. It gives me the access to the airport directory so I can see if it has special hours. We talked about that previously, as well as giving me a list of routes and indicating routes which are considered FAA preferred routes. You can easily change between sectionals, low altitude, high altitude. So I prefer SkyVector as my choice. How to issue clearance? First, you got to know what's in the flight plan and make sure the flight plan is right, because you can't issue a clearance if the flight plan's not right. So there's call sign. We'll talk about these things in more detail. You've seen this before. The aircraft type and its equipment type, whether on IFR or VFR flight plan, that should directly then make you look at the altitude. If they've got a VFR flight rules here, then this should have a 5 in the 100 space, right? Their arrival airport, and it's a good idea to hit the block button and see if the route they put in gets them to the arrival airport. Sometimes they forget to update the route when they put this in. The squawk, as we told you earlier, you'll hit the assign squawk and then use the number value that was put in here. The route we already talked about, and down in remarks, there's only one part that we actually care about, and that is this slash letter slash. We'll talk about that again a little more, but that indicates to the controlling software and to you as a controller what type of communication the pilot is able to do in the simulator. So in the flight plan, we talked about the call sign. I've seen all sorts of crazy call signs here. If it doesn't meet a traditional call sign, please ask the pilot to log out, update their call sign, and then log back in. That's the only way most of the time that they can change the call sign. The aircraft type we've talked about before. Make sure that it has an equipment suffix, and make sure the equipment suffix matches the type of route that they have. And again, go back to that little table we gave you of all the equipment suffixes, and you can use that to verify that they can use the type of route they entered. We talked about the IFR, VFR. If it's VFR, Remember, we use the METAR at the airfield. So if the METAR is showing less than 3 miles of visibility or less than 1,000-foot ceilings, then in VATSIM, we don't actually restrict them from using the simulator and to fly with us, but we do at least warn them. For example, if they're using, we tell them, VFR flight is not recommended, and we give them the weather. A lot of times they'll just switch their weather over to VFR so they can fly, and that's why we don't restrict them from taking off. Make sure that they have an actual RKO in here, and not just, like Fort Myers is a Romeo Sierra Whiskey. If they have just the FAA designator, your controlling software will not work properly. It's expecting to see the full ICAO code. So if it's incorrect, either update it for them or they can update it. I typically just update it for them. Alternates don't matter. Cruise altitude, as we said before, make sure that the cruise altitude matches their route of flight. The NEOD 7 rule, a SWEVN rule. Again, I use the headings. So 0 to 179 is east, and 180 to 359 is west. The squawk code, once you click the assign squawk button and hit amend, it'll put the squawk code in there. Ensure that they're not using some weird or generic squawk code. 7500, 7600, 7700. 1200 is okay, actually. If they're flying in the pattern, a lot of times we'll do that. 2000 is what a lot of the simulators do when they think that you're going to be flying IFR. So we typically don't want 2000 in there. And then with the route, we've talked about the routes before. You can use the plot button. You can copy paste the route into your sky vector and see if it makes sense. There's all sorts of ways you can verify that the route and the departure makes sense. And then, of course, you'll want to see in your SOPs if they need a departure procedure. And if they do, you'll need to assign it. And this is leaving from Atlanta, and so the Bang 3 is fine. But when we're in Jacksonville practicing, we have some simple ones, as we discussed earlier. Just had to assign the departure for those aircraft. And finally, in the scratch pad, what we do in Jacksonville is we put the first 3 letters of whatever the departure is. So if it's an Arnie departure, you put ARN into the scratch pad here. The Orlando will be using first 3 letter codes as soon as we switch over to the Metroplex departures and arrivals. And that should be, this is June 2021, so probably by August 2021, we'll see those Metroplex arrivals and departures, and at that point our SOP will switch from single letter codes to 3 letter codes in the scratch pad. No one's going to fault you if you use a 3 letter code starting now. The software won't read it correctly. We're not going to switch our software over until the Metroplex is in place. Finally, we talked about the voice type. So slant v slant is voice. It's pretty straightforward. Slant Romeo slant is receive only, and they'll be typing back to you. And slant Tango slant is the pilot will be receiving and transmitting on text, which means you'll be sending them text messages. That's the only time you'll be sending text messages. There's no situation where the pilot sends voice but cannot receive voice. So you'll never see that type of signal or type of abbreviation here. Okay, how do we give a clearance? Well, we issue it through the mnemonic called a craft. And this is used for whether it's VFR or IFR. And it doesn't necessarily have to be to an airfield. It could be to a nav aid. It could be into an airspace. So a VFR aircraft in Orlando would get a clearance into the Class Bravo, and that's their clearance limit. But it's usually the arrival airport. We talked about the routing before, and how we'll talk about how to read the routing through the clearance issuance, remembering that the way we read the routing depends on the type of departure procedure, and we'll talk about that later. Altitude will always be the initial climb altitude, which is either on the SOP or on the departure procedure. And the expected altitude will always be the altitude given on the flight plan. And it's always 10 minutes after departure. The frequency will be the departure control frequency. In most cases, it's whatever controller is just above the tower. In fact, all the cases I can think of. So if the TRACON is on at Jacksonville, if Jacksonville approach is online, then it'll be the frequency for Jacksonville approach. If Jacksonville approach is not online, but Jacksonville Center is online, then Jacksonville Center will cover the departure for that aircraft, and so you'll give them the Jacksonville Center frequency. We have a system in VATSIM called top-down, and I didn't know this when I first joined. I thought that if there was nobody on the airport or ground or clearance, that it was the same as if it was a closed airport. So I just happily hopped onto VATSIM and got in my yellow airplane and started taxiing. And then all of a sudden I got a message from the Jacksonville Center that said, hello, you need to call me before you start taxiing. So because I did not realize that we used top-down coverage in VATSIM when I began my virtual flying time. And finally, there's the transponder setting, or called the squawk code, that we assign to them and make sure they put it in their system. So how it works. So all of the flight plans we're going to show on these slides are all valid, so you don't have to worry about testing to see if they're valid or not. That includes the examples. So this person is on the JAX 7, which happens to be a radar vector SID, and because of that, we use this type of phraseology. Cleared to the Boston Logan International Airport via the Jacksonville 7 departure. It's a radar vector Savannah, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 270, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is with 127.0, squawk 1001. So an IFR hybrid or pilot nav SID will be a little bit different. So if they are flying the pilot nav portion to their next fix, then that will be a transition, which will be indicated as a transition on the chart. It's worthwhile to pop the chart open to look. It'll say right on the bottom left that Bartle, for example, is a transition. So this is Delta 2368 Charleston delivery, cleared to the JFK International Airport, Palmetto to departure, Bartle transition, then as filed. Maintain 4000, expect flight level 35010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency will be 119.3, squawk 1003. So if you have a departure that doesn't have any transitions, then you're not going to use the word transition. So on a radar vector SID, you're going to do radar vectors to the first fix. On a hybrid or pilot SID that has transitions, if they're filed to the transition, you're going to say the transition. But if they're on a radar vectors fix here that doesn't have a transition, and we don't have a SID, then they're just going to be radar vectors. So this person, there is no SID for Jacksonville. Well, there is, but we're going to ignore it for the time being. And we'll say there's not going to assign a SID here, so for the purpose of the example. So November 80 Whiskey Mike, Jacksonville delivery, cleared to the Palm Beach International Airport, radar vectors, Ormond Beach. That's how they're going to get there. Not direct Ormond Beach, radar vectors. Then as filed, maintain 4000, expect 16,010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 120.7, squawk 1005. You notice that I do not say trailing zeros because trailing zeros and frequencies is normally not spoken. Now, if you look at this and say, hey, this is actually and you would, if you correctly say, hey, this is actually the Jacksonville 7 departure, and it is, and you caught it, you would add JAX 7 in the beginning here, and it would be Jacksonville 7 departure radar vectors Ormond Beach. and then they would have to read back that change, and it will be then as filed. Since Ormond Beach is here and it's also the radar vector out of the SID, then at that point it's as filed because you've said the first fix that is both in the new SID, or in the new departure, and in their current flight plan. What about Class Bravo airspace? We'll do this again when we talk about the major clearance and major ground classes, but just so you understand, the important part there is that they get a clearance. They're not going anywhere, yet they're going to Craig, but they're VFR, so technically they're just flying VFR somewhere. They hope it ends up to be Craig. But the only clearance they need is into the Class Bravo airspace. So they don't have a route, a north departure or pattern work. That's not a route. It doesn't have any fixes in it. So we ignore that. And we say November 80 White Whiskey, Whiskey Mike, Orlando clearance, cleared into the Orlando Class Bravo airspace. Now, if you're smart and look at the 7110, the Orlando portion is not required in the phraseology. We tend to do that in VATSIM. If you said cleared into the Class Bravo airspace, you would still be correct. Maintain VFR at or below 3,500, departure frequency 124.8, squawk 3001. If they're going to be in the pattern, then we don't need to tell them what the frequency or what the altitude is, because they're going to be at pattern altitude. And if they're going to be in the pattern, they're not going to be getting handed off to departure. So there won't be a new departure frequency. So you would, let's go back and I'll quick read that. If this was a person who was at Orlando International and they're just going to fly the pattern, it would be very simple. Now, since the Bravo airspace goes all the way to the ground in Orlando at the airport and within a 5-mile radius, they still need a clearance even though they're just going to be in the pattern. Number 80 Whiskey Mike, Orlando clearance, cleared into the Orlando Class Bravo airspace, squawk 3001. That's it. It's a very short clearance for somebody who's just going to do pattern work. In the Class Charlie, it's the same thing. So if this person was going to be, I'm looking for what I say. No, so this example was a VFR clearance in the Class Charlie airspace. So their VFR, yes, they have a route, but because they're VFR, we're not going to use the route. And yes, they have an airfield, but because they're VFR, they do not get a clearance into the airfield. So this is simple. November 80 Whiskey Mike Jacksonville delivery. Maintain VFR at or below 2,500, whatever the SOP says. Departure frequency 127.0, squawk 1002. Now, does that mean that they are stuck at or below 2,500 for the entire flight? No, it does not, because when the aircraft leaves the local control airspace, and if they're going to remain VFR, then when they leave the airspace, the tower control is going to give them maintain appropriate VFR altitude, squawk VFR, and they'll just go on their merry way. So this is only to get them out of the Class C airspace. So we're going to do some more practice clearances later. Now, what about route amendments? So a route amendment is anytime you change the route. And if you do, like I said earlier, you got to read the entire amendment up to the first fix that is on the original flight plan. So if the original flight plan here was Dayton, and then you had to amend it to Danville Brickyard and then Dayton, you would have to read up to that first fix that was on the original flight plan. So this would be cleared to destination via radar vectors, Danville, direct Brickyard, direct Dayton, then as filed. So after you've read the clearance, what does the pilot have to do? Well, the pilot has to read it back to you pretty much verbatim correctly. There are exceptions for pre-departure clearances. We'll go over that in another class. But for the purpose of your training, the pilot has to read it back correctly. And if they get the phraseology a little bit wrong, that's okay. We're much more interested in that the data in that phraseology was correct. So November 1, 2, 3, if they get the squawk wrong, you need to correct them. If they get the route wrong, we need to correct them. If they get an altitude wrong, we need to correct them. So November 1, 2, 3, 4, squawk incorrect, squawk 7201, whatever it is. If the route is incorrect, route incorrect, and then give them re-say the route again. And frequently, if the route is incorrect on their readback, it's because they misheard you. So you'll often want to switch to phonetic spelling of the fix. Initial altitude incorrect, and maintain whatever that altitude is. So rarely do you see a cruise altitude readback incorrect because they put it in as did you. A good example where they might read it back incorrectly is if you switch them from even to odd or odd to even due to their route of flight, and they didn't notice that in your readback and when you gave them the clearance. And so you might say November 1, 2, 3, 4, cruise altitude incorrect for direction of flight, maintain whatever the correct cruise altitude should be. Coordination of scratch pads. So the scratch pad is that little item you saw on the flight plan where you can put in a few characters. And those few characters you put in there are visible on the data tags on the controller software for TRACON and en route. And that's an easy way to pass information to the next controller. We have a standard of putting the type of departure the person is getting or the type or the fix that the person's going to. Depends on what type of departure it is and what the SOP says. However, sometimes the scratch pad is not going to answer the question. So, and when that happens, you have to talk to the appropriate controller above you. Typically, it'll be a TRACON controller. So when do you have to do that? Well, if the routing is non-standard, if it's not the preferred route the FAA publishes, we actually have letters of agreement with our surrounding ARTACs that we will follow certain preferred routes into that ARTAC. And they may not be exactly the same as the FAA preferred route, but they'll usually be because of some limitation or something we had to do to make the ARTAC airspaces work. And they'll be in the SOPs. So when you get to the TRACON or the en route controller portion, those letters of agreement will be given to you, and you'll need to know what those particular routes changes are. It's very helpful to know them as a clearance delivery person so you get the route corrected. Finally, if they have a non-start departure gate, for example, they used an ARNI departure, which wasn't really appropriate. They really should have used a different departure. Then you'll want to tell that to the next controller before you give them their clearance. And anytime you're really not understanding the route or not sure how to resolve it, you can always contact your tower cab or your TRACON controller or en route controller, and they'll give you help with that. Finally, if they've got radar direct vectors that are outside of the Jacksonville or whatever TRACON's boundaries, so if they have that their first fix is a fix outside of the TRACON, then that needs to be cleared with the TRACON controller because technically the TRACON controller is not allowed to clear them to a fix not inside their airspace. So if you bring that up to them, then they will probably give you a different departure that has a fix inside the airspace, and you'll amend the clearance with that. We mentioned scratch pads. Please look at the SOPs because right now the SOP has different scratch pad entries for different airports. When we go to the Metroplex, it'll be very easy. It'll always be the first three letters of the departure or the first three letters of the waypoint. Typically, it's the departure. So finally, when they read back everything, then you can tell them how to transfer communication to the next controller. So read back correct. Tell them what the ATIS information is. So ATIS information, let's say it's O, latest information Oscar, it's current. We always tell them push back and start up at pilot's discretion. That saves additional traffic and communication congestion because then they don't call and ask us for pushback, which we don't control the gates or the ramps. We talked about that earlier. So we always tell them ahead of time, push back and start up at pilot's discretion. And then contact ground on whatever the frequency is for ground. Now, if there's no ground, it might be contact tower on the frequency for taxi. Or it might be contact Jacksonville departure on 127.0 for taxi. Rarely it will be contact center on 132.9 or 25. Or I'm sorry, 132.9 or 2 for taxi. We don't say the very thousandth 5. We don't need to because it's automatic. So finally, how do you get into and out of the position? That is by a quick briefing. And the reason there is a formatted briefing is because we've discovered that that's the most time when things get screwed up in controlling. 4 or 5 minutes after is when operational errors occur, and that's true in real world as in VATSIM. So we have this briefing plan, and it's on you to go to the General SOP and check the link in Chapter 4. You'll need to know how to do that position briefing. We're not going to talk about it on these slides. So let's do some additional clearance practice now. And we're going to do the same for all of these. I'm going to show the slide, and all of these flight plans are correct. They don't need correction. And then I'm going to pause for a few seconds. At that point, you pause your video, go through how you would do the clearance, and then we'll go over it and see if you got it right. So I'm going to pause now. Okay, hopefully you got it figured out. Here you go. Now, we don't know what the airline this is. You can certainly go look it up. But if you don't know what airline it is, it's okay to use the 3 letters phonetically. So I don't know what this is, so I could say Foxtrot Lima Golf 4058. Jacksonville delivery, cleared to the Memphis International Airport, Jacksonville 7 departure, radar vectors ALMA, then is filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 30010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1000. And then if they got it all, they will read it back, and they will say, Foxtrot Lima Golf 4058 is cleared to the Miami International Airport, Jacksonville 7 departure, radar vectors ALMA, that is filed. Maintain 3000, flight level 30010 minutes. Departure frequency 127.0, squawk 1000. They don't have to read the phraseology exactly as you do. You have to read it correctly. They do not. They just have to get all the numbers correct. Okay, next one. Take a look. I'm going to pause for a few seconds. Okay, we're starting up again. So hopefully this is what you got. I'll read it out loud and you follow along. UPS 1321 Jacksonville delivery, cleared to Louisville International Airport, RD2 departure, backslide transition, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 34010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1002. And then they hopefully read that back correctly. If they didn't get the squawk correct, you'd say UPS 1321, the squawk is incorrect. Correct squawk is 1002, and get them to read it back correctly. Okay, do another one. Pause for a few seconds. Okay, I happen to know this is called Eagle Flight. So Eagle Flight 4960 Jacksonville delivery, cleared to the Miami International Airport via the Soggy 2 departure, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect 17,010 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1003. Now, why did I not give him radar vectors to Ormond Beach? Correct, because Ormond Beach is a pilot-directed flight from Soggy to Ormond Beach. It's not a radar vector in that area. So you got to look at the chart and know which one it is. So this is not a radar vector departure. Next. Okay, example 4, we'll pause for a few seconds. And we are back. Again, I don't know this one, but for Bravo Tango Alpha 2157 Jacksonville delivery, cleared to the Houston International Airport via the Jacksonville 7 departure, radar vectors Taylor, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 360, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1006. So they would read it back. Now, if they read back and said, for example, Jacksonville 7 departure, radar vectors Taylor, then is filed, and then they said maintain 5, typically it'll say something like maintain 5000, expect flight level 360, 10 minutes after departure. So if you catch them saying that, then you'll say Bravo Tango Alpha 2157, altitude is incorrect. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 360, 10 minutes after departure. And then they have to read that part of the sentence back. And once they do, you can say, read back correct, contact ground on 121.8 with information Oscar, push back and start at your own discretion. And off they go. Okay. Next we have list of VFR one. We'll pause 5 seconds. And we're back. So you'll notice here, we don't have a clearance because it's a VFR, so there is no formal clearance. We don't have a route because it's VFR, there is no formal route. November 787 Papa Mike, Jacksonville delivery. Maintain VFR at or below 2,500. Departure frequency 127.0, squawk 1007. Remember, the VFR they're maintaining, the VFR altitude they're maintaining is, first off, there's two parts of this. One is maintain VFR means follow the visual restrictions of being 500 above, 1,000 below, or 2,000 from clouds, if that's what we have in that airspace. And then 1 or 3 mile visibility depending on the airspace. So that's what the VFR, that's what maintain VFR actually means, is we're telling them to maintain their visibility restriction. And then we give them their altitude at or below 2,500. Anything below 3,000 can be a VFR altitude. You don't necessarily have to follow east or west. Anything below, really 3,500. Anything below 3,500, it doesn't really matter what the direction of flight is. So next one, number 6, is another VFR plan. We'll do another pause. And notice that this one says closed traffic. And we're back. So this is a super easy one. If someone calls you and says they want to be in the pattern, there's nothing to it. Because if they're going in the pattern, there's no clearance anywhere. It's VFR. There's no route because it's VFR. There's no handoff frequency because they're not leaving the tower. So we don't even have that because they're going to stay with the tower for their pattern work. So it's nothing more. When someone says gets on their VFR and says, I just want to do pattern work at Jacksonville, all you're going to say to them is, November 470 Echo Romeo, Jacksonville delivery, squawk 1010. Pause, let them respond with 1010. Once they do, you're going to give them their handoff communication instruction. Okay, another one. This is IFR. I'm going to pause here to let you take a look at it. And we're back. What happened? There we go. I hit a button somewhere. Sorry about that. Okay, Comair 478 Jacksonville delivery. Cleared to the LaGuardia Airport. Radar vector Savannah, then as filed. Maintain 3000. Expect flight level 390, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1011. Why is there no departure for this fellow? Because they're going to Savannah. There is no departure for this. Could you give them the Jack 7 departure? Yes, I suppose you could. You don't need to. And why do the extra work? So you can give them radar vectors direct to Savannah and then off away they go. You have to say radar vectors at a minimum because there's nothing else in this for a departure. Example number 8. We're going to pause again for 5 seconds. And we're back. So notice this is a VFR, so there's no such thing as a clearance, and there's no such thing as a route, even if they put one in. Number 418 Mike Golf, Jacksonville delivery. Maintain VFR at or below 4,500. Departure frequency 127.0. Squawk 1012. So what else is different about this particular clearance? Well, their cruise altitude is only 4,500. And the SOP allows us to give them that VFR altitude in Jacksonville. If you go someplace like the Orlando Bravo airspace, you can't do that. You have to give them 1,500 just because you have to keep them below some of the other arrival airways. So, but in Jacksonville you can. So you can give them their cruise altitude and of course maintain VFR to remind them of their visibility requirements. And their departure frequency, why? Because they have to have two-way communication, and they're still going to be with Jacksonville departure for a few miles before they hand them back to Unicom or have them squawk VFR, or maybe the user asks for flight following outside of the controlled airspace. So next one, number 9. And we're back. I think that's Ashland. I really don't know what ASH stands for. So Alpha Sierra Hotel 7275 Jacksonville delivery. Cleared to the Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport by the Xbox 2 departure, Ormond Beach transition, then as filed. Maintain 3000. Expect flight level 310 minutes after departure. Departure frequency 127.0. Squawk 1013. This is a pretty standard flight plan, and it's a pretty standard clearance. The only thing I'll add here is, since you're going to be training at Jacksonville, it would behoove you to go through all of the departures and look at them in detail, step through all the various fixes on there and all the instructions, noting in particular when some departures are not applicable to props. There are some departures that will say turboprops and jets only. That means that the low and slow regular carbureted fuel injected propeller planes cannot use those departures. But it's worthwhile to look what all of them are and get familiar with which ones have transitions and which ones don't. It'll save you a lot of work when you're practicing. Number 10. Again, we're going to do a short pause. And we're back. So here you see Southwest 797 Jacksonville delivery cleared to the Houston Hobby Airport via Jet and 2 departure, CAPS transition, then as filed. Maintain 3000, expect flight level 400, 10 minutes after departure. Departure frequency is 127.0, squawk 1014. Hopefully at this point there are a few questions, if any, on this. You'll notice that we put the JET in the scratch pad for the jet and departure. And again, as we go through these, it's really worth your while to open up that particular departure chart and take a look at it before you do the clearance. And that's it. We've gone through this class. It has a little bit more meat to it. You may want to play it a second time or go over some of the concepts of the different departures and how they change how you give your clearance with your mentor or instructor. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you on the next class.